Hello, travellers. I'm thriller author JF Penn, and today I'm here with Steve Hall. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Joe. It's great to be talking to you today.
Yes, just a little introduction. Steve is a multi award winning documentary filmmaker and a seasoned adventure hiker, renowned for his extensive explorations of Death Valley National Park, which we're talking about today. So, Steve, let's start with some basics. Where is Death Valley in the world, and what drew you to it initially?
Good questions. It's great to be talking with you about Death Valley National Park, of course, my favorite national park to visit. Death Valley is part of the northern Mojave Desert, and it's located right along the California-Nevada border. And it's kind of situated in between Las Vegas to the east and then Sierra Nevada mountains off to the west. And it is the largest national park in the lower 48 states, and it's actually has the great size of 3.4 million acres, and it's 140 miles in length, going from the bottom of the park all the way up to the top to the north. So it's quite expansive. Now, well, it kind of started for me back in 1997 when I was with a group of friends on the way to the Grand Canyon. And as we finished up our trip there, we had a couple extra days on our way home. So I noticed on a map all these kind of scary sounding names within Death Valley, these locations such as the Devil's Golf Course, the Devil's Cornfield, the Funeral Mountains, Badwater, kind of like all scary, foreboding sounding places. I told my friends, why don't we stop there? We have a little extra time and see what Death Valley's all about. And that's what we did. We drove through the park. She had a kind of a scary experience right when we first crossed the park boundaries. My very first memory of crossing into the park was actually seeing injured motorcyclist on the dirt just off the road. I guess he had taken a turn too fast or something, but he flew off his bike and was injured, and paramedics were attending to him. So that was my introduction to the park, seeing somebody badly injured. But on that first trip, I visited some of the famous tourist destinations such as Badwater, Artist Palette, Zabriskie Point, Devil's Golf Course. So that kind of gave me a little taster or teaser of the park. Those are the same kinds of destinations that first time park visitors are sent to.
Well,
Um,
let's just get a bit into what it looks like because you mentioned a few things there, like the Devil's Golf Course I went to, Badwater I went to, the Artist Palette I went to in my day trip when I visited, and you also mentioned the Grand Canyon. So I feel like even Americans or anyone in the world who knows a little bit about America has heard of the Grand Canyon, have seen pictures of the Grand Canyon. So in their minds, when they say national park in America, that's kind of what people have in their mind, I think, because that's the most famous one. What is different about Death Valley and those places that we mentioned? Why are they so evocative?
well, anytime somebody thinks about America's national parks, like what you mentioned, they might think about the big famous ones such as Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, and those have sites that are just so famous. When you walk out to the Grand Canyon for the first time and look at that sweeping vista, it's so overwhelming, and it's captured well in photographs. The same thing with Yosemite, with the majestic waterfalls, with Half Dome. And when it comes to Death Valley, people might think of a bleak, lifeless desert. So it might not be the first first destination that comes to their mind when they're thinking about visiting a U.S. national park.
Mm. Well, tell us what it looks like the artist palette, for example. Why is it called the artist palette, and what makes it special?
Well, that is a very, very interesting and a neat place to check out and explore. It's along a place that's known as Artist Drive, which is a one-way loop road that comes off of Badwater Road. And Artist Palette itself has some very colorful hills. So imagine it's basically what the name implies. So you drive up to it, you get out and take a look, and you're surrounded by these colorful badlands that some of the minerals and different forces have created a variety of colors on display. So it really does have kind of every color you can imagine. You just look out and There's all these little canyons going in different directions. There's hills that you can scramble up. And of course, it's a photographer's dream. So, artist palette has been featured in, for instance, music videos such as the music group Oasis did their video "Who Feels Love" in Death Valley, and Artist Palette was one of the locations that they chose that you can see in the background, which is kind of interesting. So it's a very famous spot.
Yeah, and really beautiful in different lights. I imagine you've obviously visited at different times of day. I feel like I was only there for about 10 minutes, but even then you can get all kinds of different shades in the rocks as you said. But let's talk about Badwater Basin and I guess the salty areas. Talk about that those salt flats down there and I guess why it's also called Death Valley because the day I was there it was winter, it was November and it was still damn hot.
Yeah, so Badwater itself is probably Death Valley's most famous destination. And around the Badwater Basin, there's some 200 square miles of salt flats. And what makes it very special is that it's the lowest spot in North America at minus 282 feet, or in other words, 282 feet below sea level. And Badwater actually got its name because there was a surveyor in past times who brought his meal out and was in the area and led his meal up to the Badwater pool, which is spring fed, little pool of water on the ground, and the meal rejected it and refused to drink the salty water. So that's why it got the name Badwater. But visiting it is a unique experience, especially for first timers, because you can go out there and stand at that special spot, get your picture next to the sign. You can also look up at the hillside nearby and see a sea level sign. So you can kind of visualize in your mind just how far underneath the water you would be if sea level, if you were under the ocean right there. And then as well, there's an endemic snail that lives at only at that location at Badwater. So that's really special as well. And then if you look across the salt flats, across the valley, you can see the Panamint Range. And the highest summit there in the Panamints, as well as all of Death Valley, is Telescope Peak at 11,049 feet. So that's quite a contrast, standing at minus 282 and looking up at 11,049 feet.
Mm.
And then one other aspect to Badwater is that sometimes during flooding, that salt basin fills with water, and this happened just a year ago and forms Lake Manly. And then you'll find as it goes viral, people will be out there kayaking and floating on the lake.
Mm. And isn't that after the floods when it flowers?
Yes, so in thinking about wildflowers in Death Valley, it's usually necessary to get several distinct rains. See, if you just get one light period of rain, and keep in mind Death Valley it's the hottest, driest, and lowest. So by driest, it means it gets less than 2 inches of annual rainfall. But if it just rains once, you're not going to get a good wildflower season. But if you get several periods of rain spread out amongst several months, then you're going to get a good bloom. In fact, you could get a super bloom. I remember being there for the last big super bloom in 2016, and I think before that was 2005, and you just have vast fields of desert gold just covering the landscape. This overwhelming amount of flowers, beauty beyond what you could imagine.
Mm. Yes, I mean, I only went for a day trip, so you only get a certain glimpse in a day. And of course, you've been hiking there for years. But let's get into why also I guess it's so dangerous. So there are tourist trips, like it doesn't have to be a dangerous place to visit. But what are some of the dangers of the valley?
So there's really a lot of dangers in Death Valley. In fact, I did receive an email from a hiker one time, and he mentioned in his email that Death Valley is one of the most dangerous places on earth to hike. And I would definitely agree with that. So it's so important to be prepared and to know what you're getting into out there. So the first thing that people often think about when it comes to dangers is the heat. And sure enough, in the springtime, especially in the summer, but also lingering into the fall, you have the extreme hot days. You have the days when you shouldn't even be out there hiking. But if the heat seems to be at a manageable level, it's just all about bringing enough water with you, enough sunscreen, knowing your body's limitations, hiking early in the morning before it gets too hot, things like that. But then other dangers, you have dangers from flash floods. So there are occasional flash floods that will sweep down canyons and wipe out park roads, which creates a whole different hazard. And then the wind can even be a hazard. So there can be severe windstorms that come up. In fact, the wind can sometimes kick up really bad dust storms and sandstorms into the air. And basically, that's caused by strong winds that come in and then kind of pick up the dust and sand off the ground and just push it forward like in a wall towards people. And I had a couple experiences not too long ago in that regard where I was coming out of a hike to a place called the Crack, and I all of a sudden looked off to my right, to the northwest, and saw this what looked like a wall of dust coming towards me, and it was scary. And so I said, "We better." Fortunately, we were just getting back to my truck, so I said, "We better get there quickly and get in." And right as we got to the truck, it swept over us, and just the wind came first, then all the dust, and we lost our visibility. But I was glad that we were inside, so our clothes didn't get filled with it, and my eyes, things like that. And then just one other experience thinking about dust storms. My parents actually own an RV or trailer, and they were parked at the Stovepipe Wells campground one day. And the same thing, my dad looked out the window of the trailer and could see a giant wall of dust and sand heading towards Stovepipe Wells. So my dad got out of the trailer, my parents got out and went and hid near the general store. And sure enough, the dust storm came through, rattled the trailer, and kind of wreaked havoc on that whole area. And he actually said that afterwards, it took him a whole year to get all of the dust and sand out of the trailer and for it to work normally again and for the windows to be able to pop out and slide out like they're supposed to. So it was quite a crazy situation.
Wow. And you're reading my novel, Death Valley, but I put in this big storm, this big dust storm. And when I wrote it, I read about these storms and I thought, could this really happen? And I was I know it's terrible, but I'm grateful that you've said this is actually possible. And these storms, like you say, can just take everything out in their path, right?
Yeah. And in fact, obviously we can't get into spoilers, but love how you brought the storm into your novel. And it reminded me that with climate change, scary things like that could actually happen. Climate change has already had a bad impact upon the park. And again, that's why hopefully nothing like what I've been reading in your novel actually happens, but there certainly is the potential for that. We've seen an increase in flash flooding that has caused road closures for many months at a time and sections of the park to be closed off. We've also seen trees dying off, such as bristlecone pines, because they're not getting the moisture and they're getting too much heat. And then we've seen an
Mm.
increase in long, hot summers, higher temperatures going through the park, which of course makes it hard on wildlife who already are on the edge of survival to push them even further.
Mm. Well, then, with all this danger, how come you have this film, Last Chance Solo, where you went off on your own and soloed? So, what draws you to this kind of solo adventure? We are definitely not recommending anyone do this, but you obviously love it. So, talk a bit about solo adventure. What are the rewards and the risks?
Yeah, so solo hiking and backpacking is not really my favorite thing to do. I have a core group of friends who I enjoy backpacking and hiking with out in Death Valley, such as Michelle, who's one of my best friends. But not everyone is always available. And a majority of my friends, for instance, here at home outside of the park, are not interested in the great challenges that are presented. So that's what can lead me to go solo. But going solo does create some difficult challenges. So For one thing, you're out there all alone. So if you get injured or hurt, it's going to be more difficult to get out of there, to get help, to make it through. Um, Also, it can just be lonely out there, going for days on ends, hiking. It's definitely not as fun. In fact, you referenced my film Last Chance Solo, which was the very first feature film that I ever attempted to do in Death Valley. And that documents me doing 6 days of solo backpacking and hiking in the Last Chance Range. And I believe when I started that out, I had to carry 5.5 gallons of water because water sources are not always available in Death Valley. You're not always going to find a spring or source of water. So to do some of these routes, you're going to need to do heavy water carries and bring them with you. But as far as why it can be difficult to get others to hike with you in Death Valley, well, the route it's hard. There's very few trails in the park. You're mostly creating your own routes as you go through the peaks and canyons. There's not a lot of established like trails or routes. And then of course not a lot of people want to carry a lot of water. Then there's terrain obstacles that you have to deal with. There's climbing. In fact, I had one friend named Curtis who every 5 years he comes with me to the park to do hiking. But he tells me then after, he goes, well, you fooled me again. Maybe I'll come back with you after another 5 years after I forget how difficult this is.
Yeah, I mean, I've done multi-day solo backpacking, but where I have stayed somewhere reasonable at night with shelter, and there have been shops on the way, and that is not what happens in Death Valley. I mean, there is a little, it's not a town, is it? Like, as you said, there's a campground, the visitor centre, but it's not like you can stop off and find water anywhere. You do have to go a ways. So another thing about the visitor centre when I got there was I noticed there's a plaque there saying this is a dark skies area. So tell us about that. Like, what is a dark sky park and why is that so special and how cool is it at night?
It's quite amazing. Dark Sky International, they certified Death Valley National Park as the third official dark sky national park in the United States. And a lot of work went into helping that to take place. And actually, they were given the gold tier, which is the highest standard, the highest rating that you can get for a national park. So it truly is a dark sky park. And how that comes about and what it's all about is negating as much light pollution as possible. So you think about light pollution coming in from nearby cities, such as the closest one to Death Valley is Las Vegas. You can't really do anything about that. But Death Valley is far enough away that city light doesn't have much of an impact, especially the further north that you go. But then that's kind of just where you start is how the park is, how far away from cities. Then you got to think about the artificial lighting that is on buildings, is on signs, is shining around the villages that you referenced, which are Furnace Creek and Stovepipe Wells. So a lot of work had to go into going in and changing out all of those lights, which are kind of just shining indiscriminately, just brightening up the area. And instead, new lights were installed that used less electricity and were shining downwards, for instance, to light up a path so that people could walk safely, or to light up the signs or buildings, but angled down so it didn't blind people's eyes. So that's what kind of made it a successful dark sky park, just putting all the effort into that and getting certified. And then you mentioned the Dark Sky Festival, which actually took place last week. I was there in Death Valley for the Dark Sky Festival, actually working at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center. And then I hosted a telescope in the evening at what is known as the Star Party, where we had 25 to 30 telescopes out and took in, I think it was 2,300 visitors over the course of 2 days that could look through our telescopes and hear a ranger guided program. But the Dark Sky Festival is a very special event. There's so much going on. There were auditorium programs. There was an exploration fair with booths for learning about things related to the sky, the stars, with scientists sharing information and stuff that you could learn from. There was astrophotography meetups There's an incredibly talented a photographer named Stephanie Lamar that lives and works in Death Valley and actually does wedding, engagement, and family photos. But she volunteered her time to lead groups out to the Mesquite Flats, or to lead groups out to the Mesquite Sand Dunes and Harmony Borax to help them learn astrophotography. And then there was also talks going on by scientists out at park locations such as Yuba Hibi Crater, Badwater, Golden Canyon, various spots to teach them things. And then, of course, the grand finale was the Star Party, which I mentioned, where we had all the telescopes out. And on Friday night, I shared the Andromeda Galaxy with everybody. And then on Saturday night, the Orion Nebula. So it's just a fantastic event, actually organized and put together by my friend Matt, who works there in the park.
Amazing. And if people haven't been to any of these dark sky locations, they are around the world. But as you said, how much you can see the stars compares to what you see if you're in the city is just totally different, isn't it? I mean, I've been in a place in Western Australia and I'll never forget it. It was like, this is a completely different experience to living in a city and looking up at the sky.
Yeah, it's totally different. There's just no comparison. Just seeing the awe and wonder on some of the visitors in some of their eyes as they would look up at the sky. At one point, there was a ranger looking at some of the constellations with the laser pointer and even reading poetry out there under the stars. And it's just a totally different experience between maybe going out where I live here in Sonoma in California and trying to look up. And I go out to Death Valley, I feel like I could see 10 to 100 times more stars.
Yeah, it really is incredible. So another thing I wanted to ask you about. So in my thriller, Death Valley, I have a ruins under the Eco Hotel. And you said there might be a legend that echoes this theme. So tell us about that, this lost city.
Yeah, there's this interesting story I came across. So I do a lot of hiking and backpacking into undocumented areas of Death Valley to kind of try to make discoveries. And of course, when I say make discoveries, I don't mean like I'm the first person to ever find these things, because we have Native Americans, miners, and who knows, past hikers hiking off the grid. But I just try to go out into areas that people haven't seen or heard of before and share things. So I went into this place called Trellis Canyon, which was just mentioned in passing in a guidebook, but there was like one sentence, but there was no other information available about it, just to see what was there. So anyway, I went in, hiked in there. I went home and published a report about my hike and shared photos, because I did have the largest website on Death Valley hiking in the world, which is now only available to park staff. But that's where I was sharing my hiking adventures at that time. And so anyway, I started getting emails from people, and they identified themselves as like a group of lawyers, doctors, and adventure and thrill seekers that wanted to know some more information about Trellis Canyon. And so as I gathered more details, I found out that this group believes that there is a lost city of gold underneath the Panamint Mountains, and that the access point to get into the lost city of gold, where there's supposedly like just tons of treasures and gold artifacts, as well as like giant mummies that have been preserved in these underground caverns. And they believe the entrance to get there is through a cave in Trellis Canyon. Now, the interesting thing was they had spotted some scorpions on Google Earth above Trellis Canyon. And sure enough, I went on Google Earth. I could see these two matching scorpions that were kind of like just covering the landscape. So as you're following along on Google Earth, you see these two scorpions, and they do look out of place, admittedly. Anyway, the scorpions later disappeared from Google Earth, and this group felt that was a conspiracy to hide the entrance to the lost city of gold. So sure enough, I pushed the date back, and basically satellite imagery had updated, and that's why the scorpions were still visible, but at an earlier version of Google Earth. So anyway, these people went out, backpacked out. Some of them had never done it before. and tried to get into the lost city, but they never did find it. But I do hear of them going back from time to time to continue to search for it.
I love it. I think that's brilliant. Now, that might be a myth, but what there is evidence, as you said, of mining. And also, you mentioned the Native American people. So maybe you could talk a bit more about what are the peopling things that go on in Death Valley.
Well, yeah, that's a good thing to talk about because kind of like human history, we could say it starts with the Timbishaw Shoshone, and they've inhabited the Death Valley region for some 1,000 plus years. So they've been there a long time. And then, of course, in modern times, miners came in, tourists came in, and they found themselves displaced. And they seem to have endured quite a bit of mistreatment and loss of the areas that they wanted to live in for a period of about 65 years. But then in the year 2000, there was the Timbishaw Homeland Act that was signed into law, and that kind of gave them back a portion of their ancestral homeland and gave them back some of their rights. So hopefully things continue to move positively for them. And then, of course, we might think about mining in Death Valley, and that kind of got started in the late 1850s, as far as records can show, and picked up in the successive decades. But there was gold, there was silver, there was borax, talc, salt were some of the things that were mined in Death Valley. And some good examples of that, Keen Wonder Mine, which is a really neat place to visit. That's where you might find that gold was mined. And then there's Panamint City, which was famous for the silver that was being mined there. And then there's Harmony Borax, which is where actually what's called white gold was mined. And white gold is borax. So that proved to be a very successful mining operation. And a lot of Death Valley history there with 20 meal team wagons hauling out refined borax from, it was 1883 to 1889 on a journey that went over 165 miles to get that borax hauled out of Death Valley. And then also modern tourism, of course, got started as people began taking an interest in the valley. And actually it was established as a national monument in 1933 and then a national park in 1994.
Yeah, and I guess with obviously the indigenous people there's the climate change, but you also want people to visit. You want people to appreciate the beauty and also bring their tourist dollars. So where's the balance? How can the average tourist visit and have a good time in the park, but also respect the people and the land?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad that you brought that up because it's so important for visitors to be aware as they come into Death Valley National Park. And I think it kind of starts just as you come in to make sure to pay your entrance fees to provide that financial support to the park and not try to dodge that. But also just becoming familiar with basic park regulations, which I like to call common sense things. Things such as not driving off park roads, because, for instance, if somebody drives off a park road onto a playa or lake bed or the salt flats, that leaves tire tracks that will not be worn away for decades and also damages the habitat, the life that is in that soil. So there's that. There's just basic things like only camping where you're supposed to in designated sites, not leaving graffiti, not picking wildflowers, not collecting rocks or artifacts and taking them home, but leaving that in place for future visitors. Leaving no trace when you're hiking or backpacking, so not leaving any garbage or anything behind. Also not feeding the wild animals or birds. I don't think we've touched on those very much yet, but protecting them by leaving them to care for themselves naturally. Also, there is something kind of important when it comes to taking care of Death Valley, and there's kind of a situation going on right now nationally where park employees in Death Valley, as well as other national parks, are being fired for no reason. There's a downsizing effort that's underway, and this isn't coming from within Death Valley, but higher sources. So that's something we really can't have. We actually are in my opinion, we're underfunded and understaffed in Death Valley. It hurts the park now and in the long term to not have enough people to properly take care of it. So that's something that people can hopefully counteract maybe by writing letters and making phone calls. But yeah, we need our park employees.
Absolutely. So, as we come to a close, just tell people where they can find your films and what else they can find on your YouTube channel.
Yeah, so starting in about the year 2020, I kind of shifted gears from doing written hiking reports on my website to actually filming my adventures because I found it more interesting. And so I have a couple of Death Valley series on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Steve Hall DV. So I have my Death Valley adventure films, which I've currently filmed 6 of those, which are basically 3+ day backpacking adventures into locations that very few people have ever been to or seen. So really super special places that park visitors don't go to. And those often involve heavy water carries, for those 3 days, because there's often not water available. So those are quite exciting. It's quite a privilege to be able to showcase some of these amazing spots that people don't get to see. And then I have my Death Valley Discovery series, which currently stands at 20 episodes, where I'm going out to places that myself, park staff, other hikers, other friends, places that we discovered. And again, using the term discovery a little bit lightly because we don't claim to be the first people to ever walk through these areas, but we're the first to publish reports and document these areas. So that's what those 2 series of videos cover. And then I also hike in places such as the South Pacific and Arctic on my channel.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic resource. So go and check that out, everyone. Well, thanks so much for your time, Steve. That was great.
Yeah, it was really nice talking with you. I really enjoyed talking with you about Death Valley, and I've enjoyed reading your novel, and I'm sure so many people are going to love that.